It's 7 p.m. Wednesday, July 10th, here in Seoul.
And these are the top stories at this hour. President Moon Jae-in reassures Korea's top business leaders that his government is doing its best to resolve Japan's tech sanctions against Korea. He also calls on Tokyo to end what he calls its politically motivated export curbs.
It's day 2 of the National Assembly's interpellation session, with Japan's trade restrictions high on the agenda. Lawmakers grill economy-related ministers on the government's countermeasures, with some saying not enough is being done.
Amid speculation that the U.S. might settle for a nuclear freeze of North Korea, the U.S. State Department reconfirms that a complete denuclearization, not a suspension, is the end goal.
And Hyundai Engineering and Construction clinches a big $3 billion order to build a gas and crude oil processing plant in Saudi Arabia. NEWSCENTER begins now. Good evening and welcome to Arirang News Center, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Noaram.
And I'm Han-daeun. Welcome to the program. President Moon Jae-in has called on Japan to end what he called its politically motivated export curbs. During a meeting with top business leaders, he said the government is doing its best to settle the issue diplomatically, while also calling for new measures to make South Korea more self-sufficient.
Our chief political correspondent, Shin Se-min, starts us off tonight.
President Moon Jae-in held his first face-to-face meeting with the heads of 34 local business conglomerates since Japan announced new export curbs targeting South Korea earlier this month. Also, for the first time, the president called for full-scale countermeasures, saying that the situation could perhaps extend into the long term.
우리의 외교적 노력에도 불구하고 사태가 장기화될 가능성을 배제할 수 없습니다. 모든 가능성에 대비하지 않으면 안 됩니다.
The president also slammed the remarks by a Japanese politician who said hydrogen fluoride exports to South Korea had made its way illegally into North Korea. The president said suspicions are groundless and added that Japan should refrain from making further claims. President Moon also proposed a public-private emergency response system, which he first mentioned earlier in the week. It refers to a network of regular communication channels connecting business CEOs to the country's top economic policymaker and the presidential chief of staff for policy. It is aimed at allowing the government and the businesses to better coordinate their actions moving forward. In the short run, the president promised to provide more support to expand domestic production of the restricted items and diversify their sources to help minimize damages to local firms. He also proposed measures to make South Korea more self-sufficient and less reliant on high-technology imports.
근본적인 대책으로는 우리 주력 산업의 핵심 기술, 핵심 부품, 소재, 장비의 국산화 비율을 획기적으로 높여 해외 의존도를 낮추는 계기로 삼아야 할 것입니다.
To help local businesses, President Moon pledged for his administration's support in financing local firms' technological developments, which will be included in the government's extra budget proposal, a point of strong determination that the country is not giving in to Japan's retaliatory measures. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
The South Korean government has raised the issue of Japan's export restrictions to the WTO's Council for Trade in Goods, stressing that the move is a politically motivated economic retaliation. Our Kim Hyo-sun tells us more.
The South Korean government stressed Japan's new trade restrictions go against the principle of free trade, strongly condemning the move at a WTO meeting on Tuesday. While the issue was not on the agenda for the WTO Council for Trade Goods, Seoul raised it as an issue to be dealt with during the two-day meeting. Expressing regret over Tokyo's move, South Korea's ambassador to Geneva, Baek Ji-ah, called for the prompt withdrawal of the restrictions. The envoy also reiterated the grounds for such action claimed by Tokyo are invalid under WTO rules. The Japanese government insists its move is not a trade embargo, instead describing it as a necessary measure to review its export system in relation to its security. Tokyo also stressed the move does not violate its WTO obligations, adding it's just a change of procedure that had previously enabled Seoul to enjoy a simplified process. Seoul's envoy also warned the trade curbs would have repercussions for the global electronics industry, including Japan. The South Korean government also plans to raise the issue at a General Council meeting of the WTO, which is slated to take place in 2 weeks. Tensions between Seoul and Tokyo escalated over the recent days, following Japan's restrictions on exports of key high-tech components used to make semiconductors and display panels to South Korea. Such a move is seen as an apparent response to the South Korean Supreme Court's rulings, awarding compensation to victims of Tokyo's wartime forced labor by Japanese firms. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
Soon after, South Korea expressed regret over Japan's restrictions on exports to the WTO. Japan's Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary said Tokyo is not considering withdrawing them. And as our Oh Jung-hee tells us, Seoul has a series of meetings lined up with U.S. officials as part of efforts to deal with Japan's retaliatory move.
Export restrictions on South Korea are for, quote, national security reasons, and Japan is not considering lifting them. That's what Japan's Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary Kotaro Nogami said at a news conference on Wednesday.
This is a review needed to properly control exports for national security. There is no indication that they violate WTO agreements, and we are not considering withdrawing them.
Nogami added that it's merely returning export procedures to normal.
We explained that this measure means the simplified procedures we applied to South Korea before will now change to normal procedures that are consistent with the WTO agreement.
As relations sour between Seoul and Tokyo, high-level South Korean officials have meetings lined up with their U.S. counterparts to discuss the issue. The Director General for Bilateral Economic Affairs, Kim Hee-sang, will be in Washington on Thursday to meet Roland de Marcellus, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Finance and Development at the State Department. Kim will also meet with Mark Napper, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Korea and Japan. South Korea's Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee is also likely to travel to the U.S. as early as next week. Seoul views Tokyo's move as economic retaliation over an issue that's political, and Seoul says it also goes against the principle of fair and free trade, which Japan itself had advocated strongly at the G20 summit it hosted last month. High-level exchanges between Seoul and Washington will continue in the days to come, and high on the agenda will be how to deal with Japan's recent measure. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
In light of the trade spat between Seoul and Tokyo, there are fresh warnings on South Korea's reliance on Japanese parts and technology. In part one of our three-part special series on Japan's export curbs against South Korea, our Kim Hye-sung today sheds light on Seoul's continuing trade deficit against Tokyo that is lasting well over 5 decades.
South Korea has traditionally enjoyed a large current account surplus, with exports accounting for half of its GDP, but it has posted a trade deficit against Japan for more than 5 decades. According to the Korea International Trade Association, Korea has recorded a total deficit of more than $600 billion against Japan since the two began bilateral trade in 1965 following the normalization of diplomatic ties. In 1965, the trade deficit was at $130 million, which increased to around $20 billion in recent years after hitting a record $36 billion in 2010. Last year, trade deficit with Japan was tallied at $24 billion, higher than Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, which mainly export oil to South Korea. High-tech products are the biggest source of the deficit against Japan, with semiconductors and chip-making equipment accounting for more than a third. Chemical products and plastics topped $2.5 billion in the first 5 months through May this year, which include photoresist and etching gas, items used to produce chips and displays that Japan imposed export restrictions on last week.
Korean conglomerates have invested capital to diversify their final goods. Smaller firms invested in parts, but not as much in high-tech materials that require huge amounts of R&D and time. So although Korean companies have become strong in semiconductors and smartphone products, they have relied heavily on high-tech materials imported from Japan and the US.
Seoul's key exports to Tokyo are mainly petrochemical goods, semiconductors, and auto parts. They totaled $2.6 billion in the first 5 months of the year, but unlike fluorine polyamide, etching gas, and photoresist that Japan holds a dominant global market share in, those goods are relatively easy to source from countries other than Korea. The South Korean government announced last week that it would invest $850 million a year in semiconductors parts and materials, but cooperation between conglomerates and smaller companies to invest and research in new materials and high-tech equipment is viewed to be more important in the long run. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
South Korean lawmakers held another Q&A session with government officials, focusing mostly on Japan's restrictions on exports to Seoul. Opposition lawmakers called for government efforts on all fronts, while the ruling party stressed the need for Parliament to approve financial support. Our Kim Min-ji at the National Assembly with more.
On day 2 of the National Assembly's Q&A session on Wednesday, Japan's restrictions on exports to South Korea was at the center of debate. The opposition bloc claimed that the government's response is not enough and asked whether it's stepping up preparations in case Tokyo puts export curbs on more items. The government said it's doing all it can.
We can't reveal specifically everything we're doing, but we're working on all fronts. We have brought the issue up at a WTO meeting. What's important right now is securing supplies. On top of that, we're looking to diversify our importers and in the mid to long term, stepping up efforts to localize these items. We are also keeping close tabs on other items that could be added to the list.
The ruling party encouraged the government to do everything it can to resolve the issue. It also stressed the need to allocate a portion of the extra budget to support the government's efforts. To this, the government said it plans to ask rival lawmakers for their support when the government's extra budget proposal is deliberated.
Even the opposition have noted the severity of the trade tensions with Japan, and we ask for cooperation from Parliament. We will most certainly use next year's budget to resolve this issue, but we plan to ask for about $100 million as part of the extra budget to start off.
Lawmakers also questioned how the government is planning to breathe life into the ailing economy. They raised concerns that the economy is heading downhill, citing negative growth in the first quarter of this year and the government's recent downward revision of the growth outlook for 2019.
We're looking at the situation seriously. Global economic conditions were worse than we expected, and we've seen a slowdown in investment and exports. But I believe growth will rebound in the second quarter.
Also on the table were the feasibility of the government's energy policies, as well as how it plans to step up the country's competitiveness and innovation, with rival lawmakers sharing their ideas and views.
The National Assembly will wrap up its Q&A session on Thursday, with the last session to focus on the areas of education, culture, and social issues. The opposition will likely try to make an impression by pointing out the areas the government isn't doing so well, while the ruling party will likely encourage the government or give advice. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Global rating agency Standard & Poor's has slashed its economic growth forecast for South Korea from its previous estimate of 2.4% to just 2%. S&P explained that high inventories, particularly in the electronics sector, and rising uncertainty about global trade are expected to continue weighing on production and private investment. It also said that with inflation at just 1%, far below the Bank of Korea's target, the BOK might cut interest rates by a 0.25 percentage point later this year. A day earlier, global investment bank Morgan Stanley cut its growth forecast for Korea from 2.2% to 1.8%. Hyundai Engineering and Construction has clinched a big order to build a gas and crude oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia. Oh Soo-young with the details.
The South Korean construction giant says it inked a $2.7 billion order from the Saudi Arabian oil company on Tuesday local time. The plant will be based in the northeast region of Marjan and is set to be completed by October 2022. The order consists of 2 projects. The first is building a $1.8 billion oil and gas processing plant. The second is installing additional facilities to provide electricity, industrial water, and other necessary utilities for the gas processing plant. Hyundai Engineering has completed orders for Aramco in 2009 and 2012 to build gas processing facilities in Kyrgyzstan and Qatar, worth $2.1 billion. The South Korean company is also currently working on Aramco's ethane deep recovery project in Uthmaniyah, which is set for completion in November this year. Hyundai says its latest deal came about from trust built on its previous contracts with Aramco and says it hopes to expand its operations to other Middle Eastern countries. 오수영, Arirang News.
Now, there are some signs of improvement in South Korea's jobs market, with the number of newly employed people reaching a 17-month high in June. However, a deeper dive into the report shows it isn't all good news. Ko Ryun-hee has the details.
The latest report from the South Korean government shows the number of new jobs continues to be on the upswing. According to Statistics Korea on Wednesday, the number of employed people in South Korea in June was around 27.4 million, up 281,000 on year. The increase has surpassed the 200,000 mark for 2 months in a row, and it's the biggest rise since January 2018. Last month's uptick was mainly due to more new jobs being created in the health and social work sectors, which jumped by a combined 125,000. Analysts say this comes after the government created more public sector jobs in those fields. The employment rate among people aged 15 to 64 marked 67.2%, marking the highest for the month of June since data was first compiled in 1989. On a dimmer note, the overall unemployment rate rose to 4%, up from last June's figure of 3.7%. The number of people unemployed came to around 1.14 million, which is the highest for the month of June since 1999. As for the reason behind increases in both the employment and unemployment rates, Statistics Korea explained this means more people are looking for jobs as more are being created. Analysts also worry about a decrease in the number of jobs for people in their 30s and 40s, as they're supposed to be actively engaged in economic activities. On the contrary, the number in the group aged 60 or older continues to jump, this month by 372,000, which contributed the most to the overall number of new jobs. Breaking down by sector, the number of jobs continued to decline on-year in manufacturing, where jobs are generally of high quality. The number of people employed in that sector fell by 66,000 on-year, and it has been falling on-year since April last year. An economic expert explained that manufacturing is a big part of the bigger picture.
South Korea's overall exports are falling, including the semiconductor sector. Also, some analysts are predicting that the nation's economic growth rate this year will mark below 2%. The overall economic slowdown seems to be linked to the sluggish manufacturing sector.
Experts say the South Korean government's efforts to boost the economy, for example by deregulation, are crucial to achieving a significant improvement in the job market. Ko Ryun-hee, Arirang News.
The U.S. State Department says Washington wants North Korea to completely get rid of its weapons of mass destruction, starting with a freeze in production. The stance comes just ahead of talks between the nuclear envoys of South Korea and the U.S. The State Department also says that last month's encounter between President Trump and Kim Jong-un at the DMZ should not be considered a summit, but more of an impromptu meeting. Kim Ji-yeon with more.
The U.S. State Department has made it clear its goal is to seek a complete elimination of weapons of mass destruction in North Korea, beginning with a freeze on their production. Speaking on a press briefing on Tuesday, spokesperson Morgan Ortagus explained a nuclear freeze has never been the end goal of the Trump administration, and that U.S. President Donald Trump is committed to resolving the North Korean nuclear issue through diplomacy. She added a nuclear freeze is just the beginning of the process, signaling that the U.S. may be open to adopting a step-by-step approach to the North's nuclear dismantlement, starting with a freeze and ending with a complete scrapping of WMDs. Washington's previous stance has centered on the regime dismantling all of its nuclear and missile facilities before easing any sanctions. Her comments come after growing controversy following a New York Times report saying the U.S. could settle for a nuclear freeze in hopes it'll create a foundation for the next round of talks with Pyongyang.
I think the U.S. is trying to be flexible, kind of trying to postpone the big deal to the next level, and the first level, the thing should be on the small deal, which I think the focus would be on the nuclear freeze. Important point here, I think, is whether the U.S. would allow sanction relief to North Korea in exchange for the nuclear freeze of North Korea.
On the nature of the 50 or so minute meeting held between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un inside the Freedom House at the inter-Korean border village of Panmunjom late last month, Ortega said the meeting should not be regarded as a summit between the two leaders but an impromptu gathering. It's believed a third summit would take place if the bilateral working level talks planned for this month go ahead and lead to progress. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Prime Minister Nak-yon will embark on a week-long trip to 4 countries across the Asian continent on Saturday to strengthen bilateral ties. The first stop is Bangladesh, where he and his counterpart will be discussing ways to boost cooperation in diplomacy, security, trade and other areas. He will then head to Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan in the first visits to those 2 countries by a sitting South Korean Prime Minister. On the last leg of his trip, the Prime Minister will visit Qatar and discuss ways to expand joint projects in construction and infrastructure. The Trump administration has announced a tariff waiver on a number of Chinese products, signaling an ease in US-China trade tensions. The 2 countries are also set to resume their long-suspended trade talks, which could start as early as this week. Our Kim Da-mi reports.
The Trump administration says it will exempt 110 Chinese products ranging from medical equipment to key capacitors from hefty tariffs. The waiver list will provide relief from 25% duties that the U.S. slapped on $34 billion worth of Chinese imports a year ago. The 1-year-long exemptions are also good news to American firms, which say the taxes harm their business. Plus, in a surprise announcement Tuesday, U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said Washington will issue licenses to American firms looking to sell goods to Chinese telecom giant Huawei, so long as the sales pose no threat to U.S. national security. However, industry observers say the announcement failed to provide details on which products would meet the standard. In May, Huawei was placed on the U.S. Commerce Department's so-called entity list amid concerns it was spying for the Chinese government. U.S. parts and components generally cannot be sold to those on the list without special licenses. In other developments, the world's 2 biggest economies will finally resume trade talks following a 2-month hiatus. This comes as Larry Kudlow, the director of the U.S. National Economic Council and a top economic advisor to President Trump, said last week that a face-to-face meeting was on the cards. Reuters reported Tuesday that negotiations would start as early as this week with a phone call between U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He. The resumption of talks comes after the leaders of the 2 countries met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Japan last month. There, Trump agreed to suspend a new round of tariffs on $300 billion worth of imported Chinese goods, while the 2 sides resumed negotiations. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
LA Dodgers pitcher Ryu Hyun-jin has made history, becoming the first South Korean pitcher to start an MLB All-Star Game. In Cleveland Tuesday, representing the National League team, Ryu threw 1 scoreless inning and allowed just 1 hit to the first batter, George Springer of the Houston Astros. Ryu finished the first half of the season with a record of 10-2 and a league-leading ERA of 1.73. And he's just the 3rd South Korean pitcher to be chosen for the All-Star Game, following Park Chan-ho in 2001 and Kim Byung-hyun in 2002. Volunteers play a key role at major sporting events worldwide, making sure that everything runs smoothly. This summer in Gwangju, nearly 3,000 volunteers are ready to lend a helping hand to visitors, athletes, and organizers during the FINA World Aquatics Championships. Arirang's Won Jung-hwan is in Gwangju with more.
A volunteer who came all the way from Seoul to participate in the upcoming 2019 FINA World Aquatics Championships enters the registration center with high expectations for the global sporting event. She fills out the registration form carefully as it needs to match the list of some 2,800 volunteers who will take part in the 17-day event, which begins in Gwangju this Friday. After a screening process, she finally goes to receive her bright red kit, which will make her stand out from the other participants. Bright red is the official color for the volunteers at this year's swimming championships. And after receiving the kit, she says she is excited to be part of a global event for the second time, with her first being the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics.
I applied to become a volunteer after hearing that there is a major sporting event being held in South Korea this year. I am excited to learn about my sport, water polo, and most of all, I am looking forward to meeting a lot of new people.
After receiving a kit which matches their size, it's time to head towards their designated sites to officially begin their work as a global supporter. And here at the Athletes Registration Center, volunteers are in action to provide assistance to some 2,600 athletes who are coming from 194 different countries around the world. While the volunteers in Gwangju come from a wide range of different backgrounds, a special group of people stood out amongst them, fulfilling their proud duty to serve the nation.
We are currently serving in a military service. I want to try something special within the service, not only serving my country as a soldier, but also a part of something more than just that. So,
indeed, some 130 interpreters from the Army are also taking part in the global sporting event as volunteers, showing that the entire country is being mobilized to make sure it runs as smoothly as possible. The global sporting event is just around the corner, and the volunteers who are now at their designated sites are ready to ensure that global aquatics fans are provided with the best possible experience. 원정환, Arirang News, Gwangju.
The 2019 Unmanned System World Congress kicked off today in Seoul, showcasing a number of future technologies from drones to self-driving cars and more. Our Yoon Jung-min was there.
Drones, self-driving vehicles, robots, and unmanned weaponry are promising technologies and a potential boon for the local economy as well. To promote future technology and connect businesses to buyers, the 2019 Unmanned System World Congress kicked off on Wednesday in Seoul, with some 132 firms, universities, and government institutions taking part. Drones represent one of the most promising future technologies at the expo. Unmanned flying objects can conduct a variety of missions, whether they be military operations, delivery, or aerial filming, in remote places that are difficult for people to access.
The ROK built the drone-bot combat system some 20 years ago. Drones are used not only for reconnaissance, but to strike targets and provide operational support. Future combat will rely on unmanned weapons based on both manned and unmanned systems. Among them, drone bots are one of the most effective ones.
Autonomous vehicles are also under the spotlight. The private sector and the government have been working together to develop and commercialize self-driving vehicles to nurture this future industry.
As for the autonomous vehicles, demand is currently high from public institutions in Seoul and Sejong City especially for public service use. We plan to further develop these cars and mass produce them so that ordinary people can also access them in 5 years.
For those who wish to learn more about autonomous moving system and see these products on display, the expo runs until this Friday. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Washington's top nuclear envoy, Stephen Biegun, has called for NATO's cooperation on achieving North Korea's denuclearization. In a meeting with NATO officials on Tuesday, he also explained what was discussed during the recent DMZ meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, adding that working-level talks will resume soon. Biegun also reportedly met with EU officials and asked for their cooperation. Biegun will travel to Berlin on Wednesday to meet with his South Korean counterpart, Lee Do-hun, but has no plans to sit down with North Korean officials during his trip to Europe. The Australian student recently deported by North Korea has denied spying on the regime. In a tweet on Tuesday, Alex Sigley rejected Pyongyang's claims that he published anti-state material on the website NK News. He also said he'd like to continue his master's degree at Kim Il-sung University, an experience he said he loved. But he expressed regret he may never return and said he has no plans to go back in the near future. His family raised the alarm late last month when he went missing for over a week, after which North Korean state media reported he had been arrested for espionage. South Korea's Trade Ministry has decided to allow electric scooters on bike lanes. The revised rule takes effect in designated areas in Hwasong and Dongtan in Gyeonggi-do Province. Previously, electric scooters were only allowed on roads as they were classified as two-wheeled motor vehicles, like motorcycles. Starting next year, France will charge what it calls an eco-tax for all flights leaving the country. Paris says the revenue will be used to finance eco-friendly public transport in France. The amount of tax levied will range between $1 and $20 depending on the flight destination and the type of ticket bought. France is also pushing for an end to global tax exemptions on jet fuel to reduce CO2 emissions. The UK and Germany have already implemented eco-taxes, with other countries looking to follow suit. That has been your 3-minute news flash.
Monsoon rain has been pouring across the country, and it seems like the East Coast is expected to get soaked the most.
Let's get more on the weather and the monsoon rain from our Michelle Park at the Weather Center. Michelle.
Now, you should have your umbrellas ready wherever you are, as the entire nation is covered with some thick rain clouds. And monsoon rain has been pouring across the nation, with the East Coast Gwangju province expected to receive more than 200 millimeters of precipitation. Now, the capital and the surrounding regions will also receive more than a drizzle this time. The monsoon rain will slowly taper off in the morning for the southern areas, bringing out partly cloudy skies by the afternoon. And meanwhile, the northern regions, including the capital, will see sporadic showers throughout the rest of the day. And the temperatures will stay on the cool side until tomorrow. Seoul and the rest of the nation will wake up to around 20 degrees Celsius. And the highs will only rise into the mid to high 20s tomorrow. Seoul will mark up to 26 degrees, while Busan and Jeju hits up to 25 and 27 degrees respectively. We get to end the work week with some sun and with comfortable temperature readings, and there's another round of rain in store for Sunday, but after that we should stay rain-free for the time being. I'll leave you with the weather conditions around the world.
That will do it for this edition of Arirang News. Thank you, as always, for watching.
News in Depth is next.